Hi, I'm Alex Guns. I'm the fund manager of the Heptagon Future Trends Equity Fund, and today we're here to talk about micromobility.
In what ways do you believe the pandemic will change the way we think about cities?
I think we've all been forced to rethink our relationship with cities in the last few months. Clearly, being at home, not traveling, has really changed things. I think we're also thinking more about the environment as well. And cities, in many ways, have actually become quite unpleasant places. You think about the high levels of pollution in cities, the very long commutes that many people had to endure, and also the sheer level of congestion. All of those things, I think, have been thrown into very sharp relief. Think about it like this: 25% of people roughly in the world live in cities. Nearly all of those were traveling in, going to work. That was very time consuming in many ways. The average American, I believe, is spending about 100 hours a year or 100 hours a year of their life basically wasted being stuck in traffic. And so we've got this sort of quite unique moment in the world and in our history, really to rethink our relationship with cities. And I think it's not that cities themselves are the problem, but it's more that the architecture, the plumbing of cities really needs to be rethought at present.
Would you say it's true that people are sort of reevaluating how much their time is worth to them as well?
I think that that's certainly a crucial consideration. I mean, time is one factor, and it's just the sheer amount of time that's actually sort of being wasted when people are stuck in traffic, without a doubt. But it's also, I think, a sort of broader, more holistic assessment, and some of it is this discussion between work life and home life, but also it's about the impact of the environment, it's the impact of your well-being, and I think just that sort of relationship in terms of how we can use and interact with other people is also being changed as well.
How do you believe micromobility might play a role in improving this or adapting to how cities are going to look?
Micromobility is a fascinating concept, and I think for listeners who are not really familiar with what micromobility is, maybe it will help if I just explain very, very briefly. So micromobility, the best way to think about it is really as personalised short distance transport. And in some ways, this has been around for years, 100 years, even long before we started thinking about future trends. People got on bicycles, and that was a form of micromobility. So now, if you take it into the 21st century, we have almost a multimodal approach, in the sense you have bicycles, you have electric scooters, they can either be owned privately or they can be part of some broader scheme. And then in terms of the schemes, they can either be sort of organised by a local authority, a bit like London's sort of famous Boris bikes, or they can be sponsored by a private company, something like the Jump or the Lime bikes that are around in cities. So I think the idea is that effectively you are rethinking your relationship with the city, and at the same time you are effectively disrupting the car. And as I guess we'll probably talk about shortly, there are some very clear benefits we think attached to micromobility.
You mentioned disrupting the car. Would you say that's one of the key attractions?
There are several advantages, and you could sort of categorize them into a number of areas. The first would certainly be cost. And I think, when we looked at the data, the cost of actually, or indeed the payback period relating, say, to an electric bike or scooter is significantly better than that of an electric vehicle, let alone a diesel or petroleum powered vehicle. So cost is one factor. Efficiency is another factor. Just very simply, if you look at your bang for buck, if you will, the cost of maintaining this vehicle, the amount of energy that's required to power it to get it from place A to place B is significantly in favour of micromobility devices. Then you've also got the efficiency from the sort of speed of getting from X to Y perspective. Basically, a much greater number of electric scooters or bicycles can fit through a lane of traffic than can a car at any given time. So your speed from your home to your destination will be substantially quicker. I also think you might want to add in that there'd be clear health benefits. It's a sort of a de facto form of exercise, and also many people who have adopted these new transport solutions actually talk quite favourably about how their enjoyment from seeing a city from a new perspective as well.
I mean, alongside the many attractions, there's obviously some drawbacks as well. I guess the safety one is probably the most obvious. Do you see any others?
Yeah, I think safety is a major concern. There's no doubt about it, and it's almost a dual-fold issue in the sense that you have both the safety of the rider, in the sense that clearly in a car airbags are totally normal now, but then there is also the safety of pedestrians and other people out on the street. Whereas it's very obvious that one has to have a driving license, let's say, to get in a car. If you're on public transport, it's very unlikely that there'll be any safety incidents. Clearly, many of the people adopting micromobility solutions won't be so familiar with them because often they're silent. If, for example, you're visually impaired, the likelihood perhaps of there being some sort of unfortunate incident is obviously a lot higher. So safety is definitely one issue that I think that there's a concern about. The much broader one is really the debate about regulation and infrastructure. So how micromobility solutions get effectively implemented into cities. Are they paid for by local authorities and hence by the taxpayer, or are they orchestrated by private companies? I think many of us who live in big cities perhaps experience some of the frustration of seeing bikes sort of left lying around on the street. It's ugly, it's unpleasant. And there was one amazing statistic I came across that in New York, there's a ratio of roughly 30 bikes to every one bike placeholder, if you will. So, there's this challenge of the effective rollout of the infrastructure, then there's the aesthetics, then there's the safety consideration. I guess one final big observation is that it goes without saying that no two cities are alike, and somewhere like London, let's say, or New York, is very different to a city like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, which are much smaller in terms of scale, have a much more entrenched culture, let's say, of micromobility, even before it's become a sort of profitable private sector venture. And therefore the infrastructure, whether it's cycle lanes or storage capabilities, is much more built out in places like that.
I guess everybody has to respond to it differently. Have you seen how cities have already begun to respond? Are there signs?
I think that, as we talked about right at the beginning of this conversation, the pandemic has really accelerated many people's thinking on this. And I think, as we say, if ever there was an opportunity for rethinking the city, then it's been now. And you can certainly see many sort of little initiatives in place all over the world, really. If you take London, my home city, it's about 50 kilometres of roadways throughout the city have effectively been partially pedestrianised and or had cycle lanes put in. So that's very encouraging. I think there's a greater willingness, just as there is in London, in other cities too, to trial electric scooters, safety concerns notwithstanding. There are 5 trials underway in different cities across the UK at present. You go elsewhere in Europe, you think of big cities like Paris, Brussels, Milan. There are similar initiatives underway there. In the US, I could call out New York, Seattle, Toronto. Even if you go to Asia, many people would say there's a great market opportunity there, simply because car ownership is less pronounced, has always been less pronounced. You have more sort of state control in some ways of how transport is built out. So there's been huge adoption of micromobility initiatives, in a market like China. And given pollution is at least historically there, that could be a great source of opportunity going forward.
I think in the piece you mentioned that was it like 75% of Londoners and New Yorkers said that they would intend to use an electric scooter. What do you think would be the key to sort of encouraging that and taking it to the next level and making them more similar to like the Chinese market, for example? Or what do you think might get in the way of mass adoption?
It's a great question, and I think there is no one single answer, and it's really a combination of other things that we've discussed so far in this conversation. So I think it is about having the ready availability, both of the actual micromobility tools, so the electric bikes or scooters, and also the supporting infrastructure. I think the idea has got to be entrenched in people's minds that this is the benefits we outlined. So it's quick, it's efficient, it's cheap, it's healthy, it's safe. If all of those are comfortably in place, then I think you can see a very great future for micromobility. One other point I think is really worth making for everyone listening is that you have to think, without wanting to overcomplicate it, you have to think of micromobility and multimodality almost in the same breath, in the sense that, for some people, they have the luxury of being able to use just one mode of transport to get from A to B, whereas for many, the reality is they might be using a combination, so partly walking, partly taking a metro, but then also using a micromobility solution for part of the journey. So therefore, actually having all of this infrastructure linked together, having, say, some sort of app or super app, if you will, that allows you to plan your journey as efficiently, as cheaply, as safely as possible, I think could be really crucial to how micromobility and its adoption develops.
Have you seen any sort of app companies or car manufacturers even responding to the opportunity so far?
Absolutely. I mean, the really interesting thing in many ways is just how crowded the market actually became, or at least pre-pandemic. And in some sort of way, almost ironically, the pandemic, I think, has actually been a blessing, if you will, for the industry, in the sense that if you looked at the amount of venture capital money that was going into micromobility solutions, I believe the figure in the 5 years prior to 2020 was about $6 billion. That's a public figure that various consultancies have highlighted. And so you saw maybe at peak 250, I think 250 companies globally trying out micromobility initiatives. And some of them would just be in one city, others would be across one geography where you could leverage the brand, and some would be much more international, where effectively you can take, just like you have an Uber in London or New York, you would have something like a Jump or a Lime Bike as well. And I guess, as we talked about, we've seen this sort of being addressed from any number of different angles. Some of it would be government-led or city-led, I should say. Some would be private sector. Some would be, as you suggested, car companies trying to wrap in multimodal solutions. So Ford, for example, has been an active player in this space. Uber and Lyft have both been playing in this space, as have some of the larger non-listed Chinese companies as well. So, one of the interesting things I think that's happened sort of during the pandemic, and particularly when everyone just sort of stopped traveling about this time last year, was that you saw funding clearly dry up to a certain extent in the sector, and also you saw some consolidation valuations sort of were lower than had been the case previously. And as a result of all these factors, there are now fewer players chasing this pie, which ultimately will be good for the industry, we think, and result in greater profitability.
On that point, from a sort of investment standpoint, is there anything else that you think investors should be thinking about in terms of micromobility?
I think micromobility is still a very, very nascent topic. I mean, as with many future trends that we've written about and discussed in the past, it's something we really want to have developed an in-depth understanding about at a very early stage, so that when the opportunities to invest in the area become available, we will be hopefully very well positioned to take advantage of that. I guess, the only other observation that I think is worth making for listeners is that when we think about how cities are being rethought or redesigned, micromobility is obviously just one part of the equation. What we need in general terms is more sustainable infrastructure, if you will. And some of that might mean better buildings, a more efficient use of space, and also just generally rethinking opportunities. I mean, something we have looked at as a lateral or a related adjacency, let's say, to micromobility, is if there are going to be more electric vehicles in cities, how do you build out the infrastructure for that, so the charging stations. So we're keeping a very broad eye on the space, and hopefully some investment opportunities will arise. No, I mean, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening, and as ever, we're very open to questions and feedback, and delighted to carry on this conversation in a more private format.